Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and a rare Sunday show, although we did one last week, and there's lots coming up this week, by the way. We've got the second part of Empire First tomorrow. We've got Philip Blood on Tuesday, lots of things. Anyway, why was the French Air Force defeated in 1940? That's the question addressed by James Slaughter in his book, links below. We look today at the interwar period, the aircraft industries of France and Germany, and how politics and leadership affected policy and doctrine. I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Jamie. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Paul. How are you?
I'm good. So, first-time guest, I always like to ask people kind of how you define yourself in terms of military historian, social historian, aviation historian. Do you have a particular, and obviously you teach it as well, do you have a particular label you like?
I'm a military historian with a lot of political leaning, I guess the best way to put it. I'm very interested in the conflict between France and Prussia and France and Germany from 1870 to 1945. I do most of my work there. Most of my work is actually during the interwar period, so between World War I and World War II. And I also have a very abiding interest in the American Civil War. So
right. And as we were just saying before going live, 1940, in a sense, is all the various countries, policies, regimes, training, all kind of coming to a head in a weird way. It's like the outcome was predetermined by the mistakes made by all the nations in the decade before, as well as, of course, the actual actions on the ground and in the air. But it's like you can kind of, sometimes you can see these things coming. You can see, okay, that was never going to be a good idea. But we'll bring up your slides now. And folks, if you have any questions for Jamie kind of about stuff that's on screen, we'll deal with them as we go along. But any kind of big questions about could things have been done better, or was there something that we'll do those ones at the end. But I'm going to hand over to James to take us through this Airpower over the Rhine. So over to you, sir.
All right. Thank you very much. So this presentation is Airpower over the Rhine. It's much heavier on the French Air Force than the Luftwaffe. This was the product of my thesis at the University of Wolverhampton. Next slide, please. Okay, so the driving question behind this is, why was the French Air Force defeated in 1940? So what makes the French Air Force's effort inadequate to defend France? And a note regarding the content of this. This is an analytical work, and it's mostly about the background to the defeat in 1940. It's not, there's less information really about the combat itself. So it's less blood and thunder and more nuts and bolts. Okay, a little bit about France and the aviation industry in World War I. France had a particularly prolific aircraft industry in World War I. French aircraft were used by every Allied nation. And considering the circumstances of the war, where a large portion of Northeast France, where a lot of not only the mineral resources, but a lot of the manufacturing resources were centered, this really is something of an economic miracle. Basically, what happens is the French, by and large, start turning barns and caves and everything else you can think of into a place to manufacture aircraft, and it works out very well. And the point is that they actually work really well under stress. They produce very high quality planes. They're able to produce them in a really adverse environment, and they're able to keep innovating as the war goes on. They are able to produce excellent planes. I mean, by 1917, 1918, you've got the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, actually putting out bounties for recovered French aircraft engines because they're so good. So France is coming out of World War I extremely strong in the aircraft industry, and really, honestly, in a place of dominance, whereas the United States doesn't produce and use a single domestically made aircraft during the war. Now, the interwar years. France, it's like every other nation. There's a decline in need for aircraft immediately post-war. That it's just like every other war. There's always a drawdown, and what you're going to do is get rid of the things you don't need. And in light of the fact that there was no immediate threat upon the horizon, a lot of French aircraft are simply retired. There are going to be some aircraft shops that just basically close up. And France, like other nations, is going to experience a decline in defense contractors and a decline in the aviation industry for about 10 or 15 years realistically. So once we get to the mid-1930s, things are going to start to dramatically change. But that lack of a necessity for a near peer, as we call it today, adversaries, just leads to quite a bit of drop off in the production of aircraft and somewhat in development. Now, the colonies primarily become a French concern. That's the primary security concern. But the first few years in the 1920s, until we get to later on, we'll talk about what happens in France in the late 1920s. And France primarily is involved in places like Syria, again, land that it's occupied from or taken from the Ottomans. And the other really interesting war that we hear hardly anything about, it's actually truly fascinating, and it's the biggest French military effort in the interwar period, is the Rif War. And if we had a lot more time to talk about the Rif War, it'd make a great presentation on its own. But what France really does is France proves it has the ability to improvise and to come up with some really innovative tactics for dealing with the rather wily opponent in North Africa that they're after. France intervenes really after Spain almost gets driven off out of Africa by the Rif coalition, and what they end up doing is something that's absolutely amazing for the 1920s, kind of similar in a way to what the RAF is doing in Iraq, but they're creating these mobile groups. Where you've got mobile groups that are moving around this countryside that have everything from tanks and artillery and infantry to logistics and radio trucks with them. And then they're keeping aircraft on station basically the entire time the mobile group is running around during the daytime. And the air group is transmitting back to a ground station that then transmits to the mobile group, and that can go back and forth. So what they end up having is basically air power on call. In really relatively short notice. And then the air power is also acting as reconnaissance troops for the mobile groups that are moving around the ground. In addition to that, the outposts that the French are using, what they're doing is they have these little outposts like fire bases, or FOBs, what we call them now, all over the place. And they actually come up, they're able to use radios very well to facilitate the evacuation of casualties, basically with what amounts to the world's first medevac service. And they're landing these converted, basically bombers, on very short, rough runways, and they're able, under fire almost all the time, and they're able to come in and they're able to evacuate wounded troops and get them back to a surgical suite, really well before virtually anybody else is doing this. So the value of the Rif War, when we're looking at the French Air Force in the war period, is to understand that it's not a lack of thought and innovation. What happens in 1940 is a product, really, of what's going to happen in the 1930s.
Right. It's interesting what you said there, Jamie. Reminded me, we did a show about the Indian Army, British Indian Army fighting on the Northwest frontier in the 1930s. And it seems, because there's air power used there, that air and ground cooperation was actually working pretty well there, and communicate, because out of absolute necessity, you're in the middle of nowhere, so you have to have communications. And it's interesting, I think 1940 often is a case of there'd been two steps moving forward, but then there's one step back again. And I think that's going to be one of the things we'll learn tonight from you.
I believe so.
Yeah, thank you. Moving on.
Okay. Now, this is what I refer to as the clock starts ticking. And this is actually looking at what's happening about 1928. The problem that France is going to have is that in 1928, it's one of the problems is that France is going to completely do a 180 on their doctrine. They're going to go from basically an offensive doctrine to a defensive doctrine. A lot of that, and I'm simplifying a little bit, so those of you out there who understand some of what's going on, this presentation will leave out some of the details, but we'll get the global picture in. And they switch the military doctrine, they switch the Army's doctrine, and this is when they start basically going for the Maginot Line, and the terms of conscription are also going to change. So the terms of conscription are going to go to 1 year, and troops are going to be active for 1 year and then go to reserve status. Now, that means that many of these troops it's almost impossible to train an infantry soldier in 1 year. But imagine how hard it would be to train an airplane mechanic in a year, or a tanker in a year, or a radio operator in a year, or an artilleryman in a year. And the Army is nervous about this. The Air Force and the Navy are really, the Air Force doesn't exist as such in 28. It's still part of the Army, are upset because this means that their long service technicians are going to be basically problematic. It's going to be a problem getting them down the road. And this has a social aspect to it. So this is attached to the concept of leve en masse, okay? And the idea here is that the entire of the society is actually part of the military. And this seems like a relatively normalistic thing for any sort of country that's had conscription, but in France it's different. And part of the difference is that there is an innate distrust between the Army and large portions of the public that is developed between the revolutions of 1848, some of the events and affairs of the 1860s and 1870s, and then other events like the Dreyfus Affair. So the Army is an institution apart. It's extremely conservative, and many of the political aspects of what's going to happen between now and World War II are going to be headbutting between the French left and the French right, and the Army is kind of the scion of conservatism in France. And in 1933-34, of course, the French Air Force gets its independence. The first time you're going to see this name in this presentation is Pierre Cot. And remember that, because he's extremely important to this entire conversation. Okay, now a little bit about the Luftwaffe, just to kind of give you some background information. I'm sure most people are aware of this. You know, there's always secret development occurring between World War I and World War II. You know, the German aircraft industry finds a way to work. It develops a lot of civilian aircraft that are easily convertible to bombers. They're working with other countries in a clandestine manner, and they never quit thinking. They're always studying what's going on. You know, many of you have probably heard of Hans von Seect and all of the work that he does the interwar period to build up this core of very experienced NCOs and officers that will become basically the framework of the Wehrmacht as it expands in the 1930s. The Luftwaffe is also going to profit from its relationship from Goering being the head, because he has the close relationship with Hitler. He's effectively the second in command, his right-hand man, and the Luftwaffe becomes a priority. Now, if any of you have read the excellent works, for instance, like some of the economic studies from TÜVs that have come out in recent years, you understand that 1 minute Hitler could say, okay, all the steel for the next 2 months is going to make U-boats, and then the next week somebody talks to him and like, okay, now the Luftwaffe can have all the aluminum for the next 6 months, and so on. But and to that extent, there's some interference, but generally speaking, the Luftwaffe it's a laissez-faire approach to development. Hitler's not really tinkering with it. It's like go do your thing. Build the Luftwaffe, do your stuff, and they have some extremely bright minds at that point working on how to build an effective air arm for the next war.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just glad you said that, because we've talked about it before. There's the glider development, for example. The Germans seem to be bringing some of the best minds, people with foresight, with ambition, with real clear-headed, futuristic thinking about air power, which isn't necessarily the case in some of the other countries at the same time.
Yeah, and it's we're going to see some of that, a lot of that actually with France, but then again, you've got the problems that develop with that, so it's different. And the Luftwaffe generally, the other thing too is up to 1940, it's making pretty sound decisions.
Okay, thank you.
Now, war clouds on the horizon. This is when things start to really become, I don't want to say problematic, but discussed in France. In 1935, when the Luftwaffe has kind of its coming out, of course, where it was already there, but really, it's revealed more or less to the world as Hitler and the Nazis basically just throw away the Treaty of Versailles. Now, it's ridiculous to say that they didn't anticipate this. Britain and France knew this was happening. It was well known, and it was kind of a don't ask, don't tell sort of situation. Like, well, we knew they were going to do it anyway. We're not going to make a stink about it. Versailles was too restrictive. Most people believe that by this point, and we understood at some point they were going to come back. But really, I think the big crisis is the Rhine line in 36, and when the Germans reoccupy the Ruhr, that is that's the first real bluff that Hitler throws that starts to get people's attention, and it's really if any of the other world leaders, in my understanding, which is probably imperfect, but I believe I read once that the only other world leader that had ever read Mein Kampf from cover to cover was Stalin. And that's a horrible book, and it's more tedious to read in German than it is in English. He lays out what he's going to do, and taking that Rhineland back is his first sort of sticking his toes in the water. And it's at this point that France really starts to consider how long it will be until it's at war with Germany.
Thank you.
Now, the French aircraft industry, looking at the French aircraft industry about 34, 35, it's concentrated around Paris. It is an atelier industry. Now, let me explain this. The French aircraft industry is, for the most part, very primitive. You've got sheet metal workers cutting sheet metal by hand and fitting it to these aircraft as if they were World War I biplanes in a barn and you were stretching canvas over the wood. These are basically, think about them more like a hand-built sports car. And a lot of what they're doing is not the best material processes to maintain the integrity of these planes, especially the designs. The designs are basically very good. But the problem is, for their age, but the problem is that the industry is simply not equipped to actually make them. And that's not that's an observation that occurs from multiple sources during the 1930s, looking at what's going on in the French aircraft industry, not only from Britain, but the French themselves actually looking at what's going on. And the American air attaches are looking at the same thing and saying, yeah, these factories are horribly primitive. They have good engineers. That's not a problem. The French have excellent engineers. The designs are extremely sound for the day and age. There is a crisis of nationalization. And France is going to, with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, nationalize part of the aircraft industry in order to force it to become modern, basically, to force it to buy new equipment so it can afford to buy new equipment, to make the production methods much newer and what they need to be to actually manufacture modern aircraft. But politics again are playing into this. Nationalization smacks of communism. And the French left and the French right are at odds with each other, and the amount of vitriol and the amount of conflict that is growing between these two sides is very much in par with what happens in France before World War I, and where a lot of people think that if Germany hadn't attacked in 1914, or if they hadn't gone to war rather in 1914, maybe is a better way to put it, that France would have ended up in a civil war. You're kind of headed back in that direction by the late 1930s in France.
Yep.
Now, one of the things that I love to stress about this, because if you read anything about the French Air Force, you read anything about the French aircraft industry, which is minimal in English sources up until the last few years, what you're going to see is people are going to say, well, the nationalization of the aircraft industry was a failure. It absolutely was not. It was a great success. They got new machinery, new facilities. The facilities dispersed, so everything wasn't just clustered around Paris. They moved everything around to make it harder for the Germans to potentially target them, and the production actually became modern. Up until this time, the nationalization actually saved it, and it's actually going to make the aircraft industry far more productive, especially when we get to about 38, 39. Now, the problem is, and this is the problem, it's going to take about 2 years to make this work. And in that 2 years of time, you're going to lose, you lose that time, meaning, you're making a few planes, but not very many. But once you have those processes and the new machinery and the new factories in place, that's a great thing. But that 2 years is critical.
Right.
Okay. Yet problems persist. And again, this is looking at a few different aspects that are kind of particular to France. The generation gap. Now, for those of you who are rivet counters and love talking about how do we break down the different generations of aircraft, what are we on now? Are we on Gen 6, Gen 5, whatever, is the first generation everything World War I, is where do we go with this? The 1930s are really interesting when it comes to aircraft design, because what you have is that a plane made in 1930 is generally kind of obsolete by 33 or 34, and a plane made in 35 tends to be obsolete by 37 or 38, and a plane made in 39 or 40 tends to be obsolete by 42 or 43. You know, and whereas we look at, like, for in modern war, like an F-15 or F-16, they started flying the year I was born.
Yeah.
And, you know, 52 years later, here they are. And there's constant improvement with avionics packages. You're using computers to actually make the plane still dominant. It's not the case in the 1930s. And you'll go, you know, manufacturers will go for, you know, every 2 or 3 years. That's basically, you know, your production is out of date now, and you've got to move on to another aircraft because something is now better. So there's that's the generation gap they hit, and that 2 years is what really cost France as far as the generation gap in there. Labor issues are a big thing. Labor issues are always a big issue in France. I think they have been since 1789, I love France. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely love the country. I love spending time there. But, you know, you always wonder when I go to Paris, who's going to be on strike this time? You know, what's going to...
Yeah, I live here. Don't believe me. It's, yeah.
So I just hope when I go, it's never the archives. You know, I can walk. That's not a problem, but please don't shut the archives. So what the French are doing is playing catch up. Now, in production, in numbers, they're going to do a great job with this. The problem is that generation gap. So that 1935, 36, 37, you know, what they're not doing, if you look at especially the United States, or you look at Britain, or you look at Germany, is they're not catching up. That they lose that 2 or 3 years of design progress in there. And that's really the big issue. And again, the reason I put the Seclusion International paper up there is because the division between right and left is really, really stark. And the Popular Front in France, you know, it's even though it's a coalition of left-leaning parties that range everything from communists to moderate socialists, the French right sees them all as communists. I mean, they don't really see a whole lot of difference. You know, it's like light red and dark red. It's just all red, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah.
Intelligence. Who knew what before World War II? This is another thing it's always kind of interesting to look at. When you're looking at the French and the Germans right before the war, did the French Air Force, and what did the French Air Force know, and what did the Luftwaffe know about their potential opponents? And what's really interesting to look at is it's a relatively open and permissive environment. It's open source. I mean, most of their information comes from each other. And a lot of the reason is because if you look at the literature from the interwar period, and I have an entire bookshelf full of it, is that everybody is writing about air power. And the German authors are being translated into French. The French authors are being translated into German. You know, the stuff they're doing this year, you know, you're going from German edition to French edition to English edition in 1 year. Nothing's being really kind of held back. And as far as developments go, the Germans are extremely happy to show you our brand new Messerschmitts, you know, or our brand new Junkers. They're not holding this stuff back at all. And again, it's not hard to figure this out, and it's not hard to go figure out where the air bases are. Again, this stuff is not really well concealed. Even to this day, it's still not really well concealed. You have a good idea of what their doctrine is going to be. You have a good idea of what their aircraft are like. You have a good idea of where they are. So intelligence, as far as knowing things, is not a problem. But interesting thing about intelligence for the Germans and the French is it's not a desired field. It's not a really good career field for officers to go into. And it tends to be a kind of a dead end. So a lot of officers in France get sent there. A few of them get sent because they like it. The French have always had a pretty good intelligence service, but a lot of them get sent there because they either want to retire or they aren't as impressive as the other candidates, or they make somebody mad. And that's why they end up there. Now, in France, politics, again, I found an interesting conversation between two French intelligence officers that was later transcribed and made it into print. And it, again, talking about the problem with politics and the French right versus French left. There's a French colonel who is in the intelligence field who's looking at these reports and saying, you know, these reports are great. He said, but I have one big concern about your section. And the captain says, well, what is that? And he says, well, I need you to figure out who the communists are in your section to make sure they're, you budge them out. And the captain's looking back at the colonel, like, I don't know what you mean. It's like, well, you have to have communists in your section. Well, I don't think we do. I don't really talk to the people about that, but and basically over the course of reading this transcript, what comes out of it is, again, even in the intelligence department in France, you've got officers that are so afraid of basically communist influence in the army that you're really kind of purging, believe it or not. And they're unnecessary purges, because this actually comes out in a couple of other environments too, where a lot of these officers are otherwise actually good officers or men, and they're being kind of booted out because they're assuming, well, somebody has to be a communist, And what did Pierre say last week? Oh, he wish he made more money. He must be the communist in the section. Give him the boot.
Wow.
Okay. Now, leading up to World War II, the Spanish Civil War is the one sort of war in Europe that really has at least some modern equipment. It's the war right before World War II. You have Germany, Italy, the Soviet Union, obviously involved in this. A lot of foreign volunteers coming in. And the world's really looking at it, what's going on in the Spanish Civil War. And why it matters really is because, that although it was actually useful for experience for Germany, for the Soviet Union, for Italy, they tinkered with things there. What it was not was basically a training camp for blitzkrieg. And I hate using the blitzkrieg word, but everybody loves it, so we'll run with it.
Yeah.
It was not what people make it out to be, and that's due to a few things that come out of an immediate post-war environment that really are really kind of propagandistic. Now, France, a lot of people in France sympathize with with the Republican resistance to Franco, but France doesn't want to get involved. And the reason France doesn't want to get involved in the Spanish Civil War is because many people in France realize how close France could be, and they don't want this war spilling over into France and it becoming a French Civil War as well. Now, the German involvement, obviously, and many people, I think most people who like World War II will understand that the Condor Legion was involved in the war. You've got, obviously, the bombing of Guernica, the bombing of Madrid. You've got a really limited amount of air-to-ground cooperation between the Condor Legion and the German troops and other Spanish troops on the ground. It's not what it's been made out to be. So, for instance, like the Stuka, the Ju-87 that comes in, it hardly gets used during the Spanish Civil War. It's actually like a really sort of secret platform. The Germans are like holding back. Like, we're going to send some. We'll use them a little bit, but we're kind of holding back with them. We really don't use them a lot. So, but the Germans are getting a lot of excellent experience with communication in the Spanish Civil War, talking back and forth. How can we talk? How do we make it more effective? How can we make air-ground cooperation more effective? What can we do to make this productive when we go to the next war? The really interesting thing is, if you look at the French literature, the French are nailing it. I mean, the stuff that comes out of the Spanish Civil War that's really that has a effect on how the World War II is fought, it's accurate. You've got lots of information coming in from lots of sources of the Spanish Civil War that is being translated into French. If it's not from French observers, they're using other countries, the Italians, the Germans, the Russians, anything they can get. They're translating it into French. It's going into either books or it's going into Airpower related magazines, professional military literature. It's being disseminated to the French military. They're looking at everything from the effects of ground-based anti-aircraft fire to can you fly bombers unescorted? And the answer unequivocally from every piece of information they get is no, you can't do that. It never works. It's very bad when you do that. To how effective or what are the real effects of air attack on ground-based troops, which is really variable, and it's good information. So it's not like they don't have a lot of information that will be pertinent to what's going to happen in 1940 that's coming directly from what's going on in the Spanish Civil War. Now, this obviously, for those who know, that's Julio Douay, the guy who wrote Command of the Air, right? So French Doctrine 1934 to 40 is always kind of an interesting thing to discuss. And what you have is that in 1934, when the Air Force really kind of gets stood up, okay, in 34 is the year that it's going to formally, it's already formally separated from the Army, but it's the year that it's going to start organizing itself and moving forward. I guess the best way to put it. Really conventional arguments for the establishment of an independent Air Force, meaning, that Air Forces have a strong strategic purpose, and that needs to be developed by the Air Force itself. It needs to kind of it needs to not have the hindrances of the Army there. It needs to develop on its own and has something to contribute on the strategic level to the nation as a whole. Okay. If you look at the involvement, and in the book, I cover this in really good detail, but if you look at the involvement, what you see is in 1934, the doctrine itself, even though the argument has been made that that strategic air power is really kind of where it's at, the doctrine in 1934 leans very heavily into Army and Navy cooperation with strategic air power in there, but it's further down the list. What happens with French air power French air power doctrine from 34 to 40 is, if you watch it, and it's going to change every year pretty much, or about every year and a half, the manuals are going to go from Army cooperation first, strategic air power toward the bottom, and by the time you get to 39 and 40, it's strategic air power toward the top, Army cooperation toward the bottom. Okay, or the middle maybe is a better way to put it. Politics again. What's up with politics in the French Air Force? And well, a lot, actually. So Pierre Cot is back again. And what Pierre Cot is going to do, is in 1934, 35, 34, he's going to purge the Air Force. He's going to fire many field grade and general officers, and he's going to promote from the ranks up. People who have no experience at the next level up are still going to get promoted. And he basically sees a lot of the senior leadership as sort of stodgy, immovable, Army diehards, and he wants rid of them. Now, the problem with this, obviously, of course, is in a country that's very charged left and right, what happens when you get rid of many of the officers who are, aristocrats or come from aristocratic families, and you promote people from underneath, including making listed men officers and junior officers into field grade officers. It's a very Soviet sort of looking thing. And that is very scary for the French Army. Now, the other interesting thing, and this is that Cot, and he's going to be in and out. And if you look, there's a number of air ministers between 34 and 40, because the French government's going to switch every 6 weeks. I mean, there's going to be massive changes over in the French government, between 34 and 40, and some of the people who will come to power, for instance, like Leon Blum, very popular with certain people, but very unpopular with others. The air minister's in, the air minister's out, and you have no consistency with leadership. Okay, it's always going left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot, and every 6 or 8 weeks you've got a new air minister. Sometimes for 6 months, and the continuation of policy is just not there. But with Cot the entire time, and again, think about this through their mindset. Cot is always pushing for closer relations with the Soviet Union. Cot wants Cot wants to use strategic air power combined with the Petite Entente countries, so Czechoslovakia, Poland, etc., and the Soviet Union, to basically keep Germany in a vice and use that strategic air power to put so many bombers in the air, constantly flying over and back and forth, that Germany won't be able to defend itself. That's kind of one of Cot's ideas he's forwarding out there. So again, the independent structure based on sound principles of coordinated air defense in the Air Force is onto that. They're making good kind of common sense decisions based upon how to group their fighters, group their bombers, to get the maximum amount of bang for the buck at any one time, and especially make sure that northeast corner of France is very well defended. And the structure is much like you'd see like in the RAF or the American Army Air Corps later on, the squadron, the wing, the group, so on and so forth, and then various levels of command in there. Now, one thing that is not good in France is that all the way up to the start of the war, the Army has not done a very good job with training its troops for air defense, equipping its troops for air defense, and actually realistically looking at effective ground-based air defense against enemy air attack. There's a really famous line that I think has been drawn out more than once of a French infantry journal where this one French officer says, "Well, we can just hear the German planes coming. You know, when we hear the planes coming, we'll just get out of the way, and they won't be able to attack." It happened, and it's remarkable. Now, the other thing is this, and this is one thing we have to look at with French doctrine: does it make sense? Does all of this strategic air power make sense for France when its primary enemy is going to be Germany, and it's probably going to be a land war? And you know, there's two ways to look at this. We can kind of come back at the conclusion and look at this more. One is, well, if the Maginot Line holds and you've got a lot of attritional warfare and you've got that sort of thing going on, yeah, that strategic air power might be useful if you can hold them back and fly bombers over Germany a lot.
Yeah.
But but if you're in a fluid battlefield, you really need better army cooperation. And the other thing and this goes straight back to French politics, and I have to stress this: France did not want to bomb Germany in World War I. France did not want to bomb Germany in World War II, and it holds back until the very last minute because the French government is always afraid the Germans will outdo them, and that German bombing will actually have that crushing effect on civilian morale they're both worried about.
Reminds me, someone said to me fairly recently when I was talking about the assets the British had in 1940, you know, the air defense plan, observer corps, radar, et cetera, is that I was criticized for not saying the English Channel first. And I completely get what they're saying by that, because that is the kind of the first piece of the puzzle, is that everything that was going to be happening against Britain, the English Channel is that first time sapping boundary that the French wouldn't ever have unless the Maginot Line works and the whole plan around the Maginot Line works, which of course is it's problematic. So we did a show on the Maginot Line about 6 months ago, but yeah, no, it's really good. I really love the way you're taking us through this. Fantastic stuff.
Okay, now Luftwaffe doctrine. Again, for those of you Luftwaffe fans out there, I'm greatly simplifying this, so forgive me because I'm skipping over a lot. But it's an operational air force. The Luftwaffe is always good about controlling the airspace over basically an operational area. I mean, it's great at that all the way through, at least through 1941, until the strain really becomes really severe. You know, they can, even as late as Kursk, they're still pretty good at cutting off a little area and saying, we're going to dominate that with the army. A little bit of everything. You've got a lot of great thinkers in the Luftwaffe in the 1930s, dealing with everything from strategic bombing to close air support to air defense. The Luftwaffe is a really, very sort of, how do you want to put it? It's very diverse, I guess is the best way to put it. And it's very good at controlling battle space, and it has good coordination with ground forces. But I think a lot of people still misunderstand how that worked. You know, the FIVOs, the FIVO Verbindungsoffizierer, basically the Luftwaffe guys who are attached to the army running around, they're not everywhere. This is not like, 2026 where you can get on your radio and pretty much talk to the pilots that are overhead. This often has to be relayed. So it's going to have to be relayed from the army unit to another Luftwaffe sending station, and then it goes to the squadron from there, and then back and forth. And not many German units are actually going to have FIVOs with them. There's very few, okay? And not every German division is going to have a liaison, a Luftwaffe liaison that's going to be able to call air power in all the time. It's not that many of them. At the higher levels, you're going to see Luftwaffe liaison, at the Corps and Army levels, no problem. But at the division level, it's still a pretty uncommon thing. However, the Germans are very good at using the radio, and they're not afraid of it. And that's going to be a big problem with the French.
Thank you.
All right, 1938, 5 minutes before 12. It's at Munich, and I think both the peace in our time, yeah, that's great, but both the British and the French realize the game is very soon going to be up. That this is, we're getting pushed to the ragged edge, and in 1938, the French actually, even though they're suffering from the lingering effects from the Depression because they're their craftiness keeping France out of the worst part of the Depression early on worked great until they start going in. They actually go into the Depression when the British and the Americans are starting to come out. So they're coming into this on the bad end of it. They're still going to pull out all the stops as far as the military is concerned and fund everything they can and build everything they can, especially after Munich. Now, again, let's talk a little bit about the internal conflict in France, especially when we're getting toward the war of 1938. Communists are ousted and arrested. Anybody who's overtly a communist is going to basically be removed from the National Assembly. Okay, that's like going to Congress or Parliament and saying, well, we don't like your party affiliation. Sorry, you may have been voted, you may have been democratically elected, but you're gone, right? The French Air Force, because of the impression, which is accurate, I think, and we'll talk about that in a bit, that it is left-leaning. And to this day in France, many people are still of the opinion that the Air Force is the service that basically the service of the Popular Front. The Air Force is going to be broken up. So all of that great organization where you're going to have really good control and ability to not only react, but ability to project power against the Luftwaffe if it were to come into France. Now you're going to have squadrons taken from their groups, et cetera, and you're going to start giving squadrons to infantry divisions. And, you're going to give a brand new fighter squadron, not to be ageist here, but, you're going to give a brand new fighter squadron to some 80-year-old reserve general who last fought at Verdun and, has no idea what to do with them, and say, okay, here's your air support. And then you're going to have to, the French Air Force is going to find it almost impossible to coordinate. And the really big problem here is that the French Army hates radios. It doesn't like using the radio because it really feels that it's just it's a gift to the Germans. Instead of developing better radio procedures or better radio security, they want to rely on landlines and runners. And, it's kind of hard to use a runner when you're trying to talk to a plane in the air. So Gamelin doesn't even have a radio at the Chateau de Vincennes in Paris. His headquarters doesn't have a radio receiver or radio transmitter in it. This is how bad this is in the French Air Force. If you want to actually use the radio, you actually have to request permission from the officer above you. Robert Doty's books, especially Siege and Disaster and the book about Sudan, those are replete with stories like this where, you've got a great tool, but you can't use it. And the Army's inability to talk to the Air Force and then breaking the Air Force up into dozens of little penny packets is going to really affect the way that the Air Force is going to be able to react. By 38, Gamelin is also going to kill dissent, meaning all of these people who are chattering about, we should be using tanks this way, we should be using aircraft this way, we should be using this anti-aircraft gun, this is what our doctrine should look like. He's going to shut down the French military presses in 1938. He's getting tired of it. He doesn't like being second-guessed, and he is getting tired of people telling you're going to be wrong, and this is not going to work out the way you think it's going to, and you're making a big mistake. So he actually, again, a very vibrant, professional military press that is very productive, translating articles from all sorts of other nations, producing its own material is just canned because Gamelin doesn't like listening to chatter anymore. And the other problem is, even though France is going to extend its terms of enlistment and its terms of the terms for the conscripts, it's still going to be fighting against the Navy and the Army for conscripts who want to stay long-term, who are going to do things like work on an airplane or fix a machine gun or work on an engine or something like that. And that's going to be a constant internal conflict for France. Okay, now filling the gaps and the quality issues. One of the things France is going to do, and by the way, you're not aware this is a Curtiss Hawk, so this is an American-made airplane the French are going to use quite a few of during the war, 1940. France is going to purchase as many aircraft as it can from the United States because the United States has a thriving aircraft industry that's really producing a lot more aircraft and toward the late 1930s and 40s. And the American aircraft industry actually is one of those industries that does pretty well during the Depression and bounces back really well out of the kind of the economic doldrums. The problem France is going to have is kind of twofold. Number one, the United States has a cash and carry rule. You come by it, you pay us gold, and you take it on your own ships. We're not going to do the World War I thing again, where we get tangled up with transporting your stuff on our ships. But the other thing with France is that the United States has a time rule. You cannot buy an aircraft as a foreign power unless it's already been in service with the United States for 2 years. Meaning when France starts buying aircraft in 38, 39, and 40, those aircraft have to have been in U.S. service for that long. Now, active service, not just designed, not off the production line, but being actually used by the U.S. military. And if you'll recall earlier what we said about the problem being, after about 3 years, most of these fighter planes are becoming obsolete. Well, France is effectively buying a plane in the Curtiss Hawk that is already more or less becoming obsolete. It's already being very outperformed by the newest designs that are getting ready to go in production, both in the United States, Germany, and in Britain. And it's that 1930s generation gap catching up.
Yeah. A couple of questions for you. One is from Scott Grimwood over there on the other side of the pond. All US aircraft were built with their radios. So did the French rip them out? I mean, the Curtiss Hawk there, does it have a radio in it that the French just don't use, or had it not been supplied?
No, the French Air Force uses radios. It's comfortable with them. Okay, that's not the issue. But the French Army doesn't, and that's going to create a big problem in May. June, it's going to create a colossal problem. The French Air Force is comfortable with it. Okay, they understand that there's no way you can do this. So the radios are there. The French ask for a few minor modifications to the aircraft, but basically, so they want the Browning machine guns all in 7.5 French. So, but other than that, most of what's in the plane is pretty much stock, other than a few little tweaks that they ask for. So the radio.
Another question was, during all the sort of the changes of personnel and leadership in the mid 30s, did that affect aircraft production orders? For example, was a guy A coming in, then guy B comes in and can't cancel guys A's order and puts his own order in for something slightly different just to make a change? Had that affected delays of bombers and fighters and things coming off the production lines?
Well, actually, with the production line, the French keep ordering masses of aircraft, and it's a really interesting French problem. They're going to keep ordering. The government will order thousands of planes, and toward 38, 39, especially after Poland, they just open the stops, right? So the problem is they're ordering aircraft that are obsolete, like the MS-406, for instance, right, which is going to be a mainstay of the French Air Force. It's because they can make it, right? They can make the MS-406, which is already in production in the mid-1930s, and once they have the modern facility, they can make a lot of them. And they do a good job of it, but that plane should have stopped being manufactured in like 1936. And the newer designs, like the D520 that are coming online, that 520 is a little bit behind, honestly. The newest stuff on the drawing board is just not going to the production lines fast enough. And that gap, they keep producing planes they can make, and they haven't had enough time with these newer designs to build them or prototype them and test them and tweak them and then produce them. So that's really the problem. They're happy to make as many as they can. Now, the other problem they're going to have with production specifically is that lots of times the aircraft are going to be accepted by the French Air Force. They don't have all their parts. And some of the reason that you hear about the Germans overrunning French airfields and there's all these brand new airplanes there, part of what's not coming out about some of those reports is some of the reason there's a lot of French aircraft sitting around is the airframe was made, the engines are on it, but they're missing gauges. Or the airframe's made, the engine's on it, and they're missing guns. Or the airframe's there and the guns are there, but they're missing, engines or something like that. So it's a very awkward procurement system. And the way it's accepted, there's several levels of acceptance until it gets to the squadron, and lots of times those levels of acceptance leave the plane kind of incomplete.
Okay, thank you. Back to Pierre Cot.
Oh, yes. Now, here we go. Born to a conservative Catholic family, fairly conservative early on in his life. He goes increasingly left the older he gets. Wants to be foreign minister. He's air minister twice, including under Blum, but he's never made foreign minister. Part of the reason that even Blum, I think, doesn't make him foreign minister is because he really pushes that relationship with the Soviet Union. He is committed to that, and that coziness of the Soviet Union makes everybody nervous. One of the things I always like to tell my students about World War II is that it's not really obvious until 38 or 39 that Germany is going to have a big problem. And once Poland is invaded, you've got a serious issue on your hands. The bugbear around the corner to the United States and France, and really, I think even to some extent, Britain, was the Soviet Union all the way through the 1930s until Germany obviously becomes a problem. And you have to understand the context of that is that, you're looking at somebody who wants to kind of cozy up to what a lot of people in France think is their arch nemesis, and that makes them nervous. The fact that he guts the Air Force early and he gets rid of those high-level French officers and he promotes from the ranks, that looks like a very sort of Soviet thing to do. The other thing he does that really irks the French nobility is that he provides a lot of state money to allow the average sort of working man to go join aviation clubs. And, this is like an airborne polo ground for the French elite. And all of a sudden he's, saying, Gaston from down the road, he may be a chicken farmer, but he wants to learn how to fly a plane. So you're going to have to deal with him being in your little aero club. And the government's going to pay for it. Again, is that a leftist thing? Yeah, but it also rankles them on a personal level. It's really interesting to kind of read some of the reaction to that. And the most important thing about Pierre Cot, and the part that the French right had right, even though they didn't know they were right, he was a spy. He had his handlers called him Daedalus, an appropriate name. Nobody knew this until after World War II. This was not common knowledge. So the Venona decrypts that you see there is a copy of a book that I got from the National Security Agency. The NSA and the CIA printed that. Back when I was doing this work, the NSA was super, super responsive. You want to call the NSA and talk to their historians, they would talk all day long if you wanted to. Recently, working on another project, I've reached out to the CIA, and I don't know if it's official policy or what, but they're a little chillier than they used to be about talking to historians. So I'm not quite certain why, but that relationship isn't I'm sure it's not the people in the offices. I'll put it to you that way. When Venona's decrypt after World War II, this is the Soviet diplomatic code that the United States can't read until 47. Cot starts showing up in it a lot. And Venona suggested, and all the decrypts are actually in that book, Venona suggested that he was a spy, but it couldn't prove it. But it leaned, it certainly implicated Cot as at least talking to the Soviet Union, perhaps. After the Cold War, the files revealed that he actually was a spy. He was actually spying for the Soviet Union. The question that remains is that how long was he doing it? And that's the problem. That's what I've not been able to figure out. It may be out there, but again, I don't know exactly how long. What I can say is that I'm fairly certain, based upon the evidence, that when Cot was in the United States, because he flees France in June, while he's at Princeton and while he's making his speaking circuits and while he's doing all this other work, at that point, it's pretty clear he was spying for the Soviet Union. And he has a very warm and fuzzy post-war relationship with the Soviet Union. He's one of the last Western leaders to be seen prominently with Stalin right before Stalin dies. There is virtually no doubt that Cot now was doing this. Now, a lot of this stuff, so this information was not released until after Cot's death. So Cot dies in 1975, I believe. And this information isn't released in this Venona transcript's not released until, the early 2000s. And then, excuse me, the other information on that confirmed his being a spy isn't revealed until after 2010. So he's long dead by the time it becomes official. So they were worrying for good reason. Now, reassessing the air battle in 1940, and I hope the viewers will forgive me because I'm recovering from the flu and it's very difficult to talk.
People are loving it. Don't worry.
Okay. Poland causes a panic, and Gamelin even panics. I mean, he finally realizes, looking at what happened in Poland, maybe I was wrong. And all of these obstinate French thinkers from the Air Force and the Army all of a sudden look like they're being proven right by Poland, and he finally relents at the last minute, but it's too little, too late. It's not that these guys aren't trying; it's just it doesn't work, right? Not enough time to make it work. The Army attempts to adapt. The Army does an admirable job trying to make functional tank divisions, to make them work on the model that they think. They think they saw the Germans doing, that the interwar thinkers are dealing with. They try, and it's just not enough time. Germany's been doing this, since 1934, and now you're going to tell me I've got 6 months to figure it out and make it work. It's a lot. It's not much time. The radios are one thing they don't relent on. The French Army is just as insistent as anything that those radios are going to get us in trouble. And what's the very first thing that happens under an artillery bombardment or air bombardment when you've got basically field communication with wires? What happens to them? They go away instantly. And with not enough practice of radios and radio procedures, and especially not actively communicating to cooperate with the Air Force, what's going to happen in May and June of 1940 is almost kind of predictable. The Air Force is still dispersed. There are squadrons everywhere. They aren't, the Air Force is going to try to fight a unified battle to the best of its ability, but it's not, because of the way it's dispersed and the way the organization is set up, it's not going to be able to do it the way it wanted to fight it. It's going to fight in a reactive posture. The French Air Force is going to fight virtually this entire conflict from a reactive posture. And that's unfortunate because it's never able to gain the initiative. And let me assure you, these pilots are excellent. And I'm going to prove that in a minute. They're excellent pilots. The people in the Air Force are great things. They are not in any means cowards. These men are ready to fight. It's just that they're fighting with one hand tied behind their back.
I think your point there about being reactive is so pertinent. When we've discussed the performance of the French Army and things like that, they have the numbers. As you said there, they've just about, a bit too late, but they've just about addressed the doctrinal issues. But they're letting the other team play their game as opposed to imposing their game, which theoretically could be a bigger game. But if you're reacting, yes, I'll let you carry on.
Yeah. Well, just an anecdote before we go into the next slide. The French reconnaissance air reconnaissance sees the stalled German columns in the Ardennes. They tell the French Army, and they tell French headquarters, look, they're backed up for miles. Just let us go bomb them. We can stop this right now. We can turn those narrow little roads into an absolute graveyard. And the response from Gamelin is no, you can't do that. It's going to cause too much damage. It might agitate the Germans. It might cause civilian damage. We're sorry, but the answer is no.
Yeah, good grief.
Now, this is my favorite part, really, in some ways, of this press. And I understand that this wreck is in Africa. I get it, but it's a burnt German plane, and it made me happy, so I put it on here. Okay. All right. Let's look at the numbers. These are numbers from the Luftwaffe. This is not what the RAF says. This is not what the French Air Force says. This is what the German Air Force says. From 10 May to 16 May, which is really when all this is coming unglued after Sedan, okay, the Luftwaffe says its total losses to the RAF are 167 aircraft, meaning the Luftwaffe is saying we lost 167 planes to the Royal Air Force in those 6 days. In that same 6 days, the Luftwaffe is saying we lost 161 aircraft to the French Air Force. Now, what does that say about how the French Air Force pilots, who are disorganized, who are not able to fight this war the way they want to fight it, who don't have the ability, who know what they want to do, but are fighting on a reactive basis, what does that say about their ability to fight? When they are fighting with every disadvantage and they're fighting on a par easily with the RAF. You can't say that 6 aircraft is enough to call it a difference. Now again, when you're looking at German claims against the various air forces in those same days, Germany claims 150 RAF aircraft between 10 and 16 May and 165 French Air Force aircraft in that same period. So again, those numbers are really close. And the other thing this doesn't. I've actually got the breakdown of type. I mean, I've got this BF 109 was lost to an MB 153 and so on and so forth, without going into basically pages and pages of charts. What part you're seeing in that slight bit more with the French Air Force aircraft is that they're not as good. They're just not as good. And again, 15, you're looking at 150 to 165. That's not much of a difference. Now, after this, of course, the Allied war effort, especially after 16th of May, is going to become completely unglued. And one of the big problems that's going to come out of this is part of the problem with the French Air Force is going to have, it's going to be worse, is all of their tiny little airforts all over the place are going to be overrun. And all of their spare parts and all of their mechanics are going to be the prisoners of panzer divisions and follow-up infantry divisions because they didn't have time to evacuate them.
People have mentioned asking in the sidebar, Jamie, about how big was the French Air Force, or rather, is this because as you said earlier, the French Air Force is spread across the whole country. So in terms of the number of squadrons actually sort of facing the Germans in May, what are the numbers of French aircraft in that area and RAF British aircraft in that area? How does it break down roughly?
They're roughly equal to what the Germans have.
Right.
Okay. Now, if you look at total numbers, the French Air Force has more planes, and the RAF, I believe, has more planes in 1940 than the Luftwaffe does at the theater level. So right there. Okay. Yeah. But if you look at total numbers, the other thing you're going to see is the French Air Force still has planes from 1924 it's flying. Right. Yeah. They've got just hundreds of obsolete planes, like the Soviet Air Force, the Red Air Force in 1941. Yeah, it's the biggest Air Force in the world, but half the planes should have been retired 10 years ago. So their very modern planes are up front. The very modern aircraft, the best aircraft they have. They've got a few in the colonies, but most of them are actually up in Champagne, up in the northeastern region of France. But numbers-wise, they have almost as many modern aircraft as the Germans do, but with that generation gap in there, I like to stress. But total between the RAF and the French Air Force, it outnumbers the Luftwaffe. And they outproduce them. And that last year when the French and the British are cranking out everything and buying everything that's not nailed down, they're going to produce more aircraft in 39 and 40 than the Germans are.
Thank you.
Now, this is the bad part. This is the delamination part. As the Army is rapidly overcome and outmaneuvered, a loss of technical personnel parts becomes a serious problem. So, you think about it. You've got many different aircraft types, and those aircraft types are spread across all sorts of different airfields. And what's happening is that they're being overrun so fast that you can't get the men out, you can't get the spare parts out. And okay, so your D520 or your MS-46 or whatever, you make it back to an aerodrome on the other side of Paris, but your mechanic is now a prisoner of the Germans, and all your spare parts are over there. And it's you with these aircraft types, you have to know what you're fixing on the aircraft. Now, an aircraft mechanic can probably improvise a little bit, but when it's a different story. Every plane is different, and you have to know the quirks of it. You have to know how it works. You have to be familiar with it. And they're losing lots of valuable technical personnel. Now, they maintain fight throughout the armistice. There's a really famous line in Adolf Galan's book, The First and the Last, where he's talking about flying in the last part of the campaign in June. And Galan says in June, the only planes he saw were French. And the only planes he engaged were French. So the French never quit fighting. All the way through Fall Gov, Fall Road, the whole thing, they fight the whole way. But the problem is it's just diminishing returns the entire time. They're constantly losing men and machines, and they can't replace them. And there's just, it's not that they quit. It's just that they can't replace the stuff that they lose. The pilots, the men, everything.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Now, why the vitriol? This is a really interesting question. I spent a lot of time addressing this, trying to figure out what's going on. Number one, the Rhine trials. That's where it starts. In my opinion, and I am a defender of the French army in a lot of ways, but I think the most shameful episode in the French army is what it does at Rhine. It basically just it throws the loss of 1940 at the feet of the Air Force, and it just basically does not acknowledge any of its own faults, and it shames itself in what it does at Rhine. Now, this is under the Vichy government, okay?
Yeah,
that happens, but I think that the most shameful event is not losing the war. It's not, it's not just being defeated. But what it does at Rhine is absolutely terrible, and that's where I think it starts. Post-war politics, cozying up to the Wehrmacht. You want the Bundeswehr, right? You want NATO to work, and all of a sudden, all these German generals, you're becoming really chummy with them. You believe whatever they say, and honestly, I really think more than anything, the campaign in France is more mythologized in a lot of ways. Oh yeah, we just we wiped the floor clean with everybody until we got to the Soviet Union, and then Hitler interfered, and then we lost. Right. Yeah. And I think, that I think, number one, a little bit of that is revenge for World War I, that they really felt good about beating France. But the other thing is it just gets horribly mythologized. And then, wanting to believe everything the Germans say, that plays into it. The Anglophone history focuses on the wins, the Battle of Britain, the air campaign, strategic bombing, all of those things. The air war looks great from 1941 forward, or even the Battle of Britain forward, the Blitz forward. That looks great. The RAF defending Britain. We won't talk about the French part, and we won't talk about the RAF performing as badly as the French Air Force did. All of those things. We'll just sweep that under the rug. Now, actually, one thing I will argue is the RAF and the French Air Force actually fought very well in 1940 in France. It's just that it didn't work. It wasn't enough, right? So it's not a bad showing. It's just that it was a defeat, and the defeat itself was embarrassing. Okay, and the last thing, the French Air Force, and this is the last couple of pages in my book, it was not a no-show. Considering the circumstances, its pilots deserve the accolades that they should have received. That's why I put the Legion d'Honneur on there, even if it's far too late. These guys put in an incredible effort. They had to deal with a country that's politically divided, the politics messing with their doctrine, the politics messing with their equipment, the politics messing with the plane production. It's, and I think when you look at the United States and you look at Britain, especially during World War II, you don't really see that too much. There's not, FDR and Churchill aren't demanding that aircraft factories produce a certain way, that division is just not there, that creates these circumstances that really gets the French Air Force defeated. And it kind of in closing, the one thing that I want to stress is the French Air Force, especially the pilots above everybody else, deserve an incredible amount of credit that they just never received. They were incredibly brave. They fought a very good battle, considering the circumstances they fought over. And I think we really need to reassess the way we look at them.
Well, thank you. We've got a couple of questions, Bob. One for me first. I mean, the trials you mentioned now, I think part of the reason why the Air Force gets thrown under the bus, would you say that's because of the fact there are a lot of new personnel, it's the people promoted from the ranks, there's not that aristocracy that retained in the German army? So you blame the new guys, in a sense, rather than the establishment, because there were, as you mentioned, there are a lot of senior French generals who either end up resigning or in captivity, whatever it would be. So don't blame them. Blame the new kids on the block. Well, we didn't want them anyway. They were the new ones. They were the ones who fucked it up. Is that part of it, do you think?
I think there's two things going on here. Number one, I think that there's a lot of animosity between the French Army and the Air Force anyway, because of the conservatism in the Army and the kind of left-leaning Air Force. They're an easy target because there's not hardly anybody from the Air Force at the real trials to defend them. And I think the other thing, and I think this is really key, the Army was horribly ill-prepared to defend itself against the Luftwaffe. If you look at a lot of the RAF losses and a lot of the French Air Force losses, especially when at Sedan in particular, they're going in to attack those bridges to stop the Germans from crossing the Meuse. And what is really eating up the RAF, the French Air Force, are the German Army's ground-based air defenses. 88s, 37 millimeters, 20 millimeters, MG-34s, sitting on tripods. They have worked on this. They knew they were going to have to deal with this, and the German Army was ready to defend itself from aerial attack, and the French Army wasn't. Mm-hmm. And even when we look at the damage assessments, and we really objectively look at what Airpower does, especially 1940, 41, that era, it's not really damaging a lot of French equipment, but that morale effect it has on that constant aerial bombardment is pretty severe. And they do have some good equipment right before the war, but they're just not trained to use it. It's like Doty talking about, the French infantrymen defending the Meuse that don't even know how to use a modern French hand grenade. The French Army is replete with problems. And I think what it's really doing is trying to move the shame off of itself and just dump it on the Air. The Air Force is just a convenient scapegoat. And it's not there to defend itself. Cot has fled. And it's just, again, it's just an easy target.
Thank you. I think, the Army, in a sense, got a chance to redeem itself. There were rematches. General Leclerc's division later on, what they did in Central Africa, North Africa, and things like that. So they get a chance to go to regroup, even on a small level, like French commanders. I know there's French pilots flying with the RAF things later. I know that there are still French people involved in the Allied war-winning effort, but not kind of with their own identity, not in the same way that the Army does to redeem itself. And another thing I was going to say is that if the world considers the Battle of 1940 not being quite as one-sided as history has said it doesn't make the victory that came later on seem as sweet. I mean, as a Normandy guy, I hate the fact that it's Dieppe is used as the precursor to Normandy. Because Dieppe then goes from disaster to victory is a much better story to sell. Where I would put Torch and Husky as far more important in the lineage of Normandy, but they both worked, so they don't have the dramatic turnaround as comparing Dieppe to Normandy. So I think in order to celebrate the Allies' successes later on, having a much more dramatic defeat in 1940 makes that victory that came later on seem more appropriate somehow, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And, one of the things that Americans, because here in the United States, we just have, the jokes about the French Army just never stop, especially from the armchair historians. One of the things that hardly ever gets mentioned is the United States Army's operations manual up until June of 1940 was almost a direct translation of the French Army's operations manual. And that the United States Army put in a similar situation in France in 1940 would have had the same basic result based upon the way it was equipped and fought as the French and the British did. And the idea that it somehow would have turned out differently because we're Americans is absolutely ludicrous, because we were basing our army basically off of French ideas up to that point. And I really, sorry if I seem like I'm on a soapbox, but I really get tired of that.
Yeah. No, thank you. So a couple of questions from viewers. So Dennis over in California is saying, did Jamie ever have the opportunity to interview any French Air Force veterans? Obviously, you've accessed a certain amount of oral histories, but did you ever get a chance to sit down and speak to any?
Unfortunately, no. By the time that I started this project, I wasn't aware of any French Air Force pilots that were still alive. I did get to read some of their correspondence transcripts, that sort of thing. I wish I had, but I started it too late. Honestly, when I was looking at this, I thought, man, I wish I had a chance to start this in the late 90s, early 2000s, but I did not.
I mean, the fact that they're flying in 1940, if comparing that to a veteran of 1944, 45, they're 4 or 5 years older anyway, which doesn't make it easier. Gregory is asking, any idea what the impression of the French Air Force was among the French citizenry in May, June 1940? That's a really good question, really, because, we know coming out of the Battle of Britain era that the British have this huge faith in their Air Force and the dogfights over Kent, more so than they're aware even of the Observer Corps and radar. But is there anything sort of contemporary? Were cartoons made about the French Air Force, or for example, in that time?
Well, actually, if you look at the French popular press leading, especially like 1939, 1940, leading up to the war, it's very positive. They have confidence in the Air Force, confidence in the planes. They're not really, the French popular press is not really talking about the same thing that a lot of the French Air Force officers are like, if we could put the Air Force back together, this would be great. French air power is popular. France is a very air-minded country. It has been from the very beginning.
Right.
And the general impression is positive, and there's generally a lot of support for the French Air Force, just like the Army. I mean, keep in mind, again, I don't want to sound too preachy, but going into 1940, everybody said the French Army was the best army in the world. And, you know, that seemed to be the popular sentiment, or if not the best, one of the best armies in the world. And there was faith and there was confidence in it. It's not that, again, it was misplaced in the men. The misplacement was in the organization. It just wasn't able to fight the war it wanted to fight.
I mean, this question, we all know what the answer is going to be anyway, but I'll put it up there. From standard interpretation holds that Germany had near complete air superiority over France. Is that worthy of reassessment? So a big resounding yes, I'm assuming, coming from your corner there.
It is, because the Germans never had, the Germans had to fight to control that airspace, especially in the first 10 days, where there's still good, somewhat organized resistance. It's not a walkover at all. I mean, you saw the numbers. They're getting, and that's just the planes that are total losses. That's not damaged. The damage numbers are actually much higher than that. Planes that
or indeed whether or not the missions in which they lost those aircraft ended up being less successful because of those losses. I mean, that's when we were talking about the Luftwaffe flying into Germany last week with Donald, where, you know, that two aircraft shot down out of a squadron can affect how that squadron continues to go and do so. So it's not just the actual losses of aircraft; it's the effect that has on, if you like, operational tempo.
Yeah, exactly. And you know that Germany, the Luftwaffe is able to help the Army meaningfully actually accomplish its mission, and I think that the record indicates that. But it has to fight for it. I mean, it has to fight for every inch, and the German Army is fighting back against the French Air Force and the RAF. It's just better able to do it, and they're more confident in their ability to do it. You know, being able to shoot back makes you feel better.
Yeah.
And you know, that's what the German Army is able to do that the French Army is not really well disposed to do. So, but yes, well, I think you do need to reassess this a lot. Actually.
Yeah, I mean, the positive thing is people like you are writing about this and getting that information out there. And folks, again, the links to the book is in the description below, or you can find it wherever you get your books. The negative side is these myths are so entrenched that 100 books could come out in the next 2 years and it won't change the idea. I know, you know, if I'm at the pub in Bayeux in Normandy and some Americans come in and the discussion of the French army comes up, they will make the jokes about, you know, why do the French roads have trees at the side, all those kind of stuff. I'm not going to repeat it now. But now some of these are like third generation people passing on those jokes who don't even quite know what the basis for the joke is. It's just it's so established now that you make jokes about the French in 1940 that I wish I could see a change for that and a reverse in that. But it's to me, it's one of those things that, like Napoleon being short when he wasn't, that the world have just that's it. We don't want to know. It doesn't matter how many Oxford University people say, you know what, Napoleon was average height for. Is it that people don't want to they don't want to listen now? Right. The world, and I think there's an element of that about 1940. We think we understand the Battle of 1940,
right?
And it extends into the Britain alone thing and the fact that Britain was saved by these upper class pilots, when in fact we forget about Bomber Command and Coastal Command and integrated air defenses. So I don't think in some ways we're doing anything other than pissing in the wind in this, but at least we're trying. At least we're trying.
Yeah, but it is. You know, one thing I'll tell you, and maybe it may seem a little despairing, but it also is a cause for hope. One of the other things I teach a lot about is the American Civil War. And the myths that people still believe about that in 2026 are profound. But I'm beginning to notice a change in the way that people talk about the American Civil War. Finally, people are getting, you know, better information about it.
So what you're saying then is we have to wait another 70 or 80 years. If we're, what are we, nearly 160 years? We're only halfway through the historiography. There's hope. There's hope.
We're almost there. I
World War II TV of 20, about the turn of 22, 21, whatever, the change will have happened. Well, that's good to know. Anyway, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you, Jamie. And I urge my viewers to go and get that book and have their perceptions of this period challenged. And we're back talking about more challenging perceptions. We're talking with Graham again tomorrow about Churchill and his policy of empire in part 2 of that discussion. So, folks, I will see you all again tomorrow. Thank you very much, Jamie. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. I think that sums it up there, Gareth. This has been another great show, a real eye-opener. Thank you, Jamie and Woody. So there we are. Cheers, everybody. See you tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.